She stood at the edge of the dusty training range, feeling the morning sun heat the back of her neck as the echo of distant gunshots rolled across the hills like thunder chasing the earth. And even in the noise and chaos, there was something steady. In her eyes, something that made people glance twice without knowing why, as if she were a storm wrapped in silence waiting to be unleashed. And the recruits nearby whispered about how the instructors handed her a sniper just for fun, not knowing. She once treated rifles like extensions of her own breath, and every step she took across the gravel felt like the beginning of something none of them were ready to see. Yet deep down, she sensed that today would not end ordinary, and that the world around her was about to witness what she had kept hidden for far too long, but no one understood the weight she carried beneath that calm gaze. And no one knew the reason she had stopped shooting competitively years ago and walked away from the life that once made her a legend, which was why the moment she lifted the rifle to inspect it, the air seemed to shift as if reality itself held its breath. And the question lingered in the watching crowd about whether she would rise again or collapse under a past that waited like a shadow, ready to engulf her when the time came to pull the trigger. The range was alive with chatter and bravado as dozens of shooters boasted about wind calls and ballistic charts while she simply knelt beside her, bag and laid out her small tools with steady precision, ignoring the exaggerated laughter around her and the smug expressions of men who thought long-range shooting belonged only to those who shouted the loudest. Yet, her silence spoke louder than all of them because every motion she made was clean, efficient, and deliberate, as though muscle memory was guiding her rather than thought. And though she kept her expression blank, her senses were razor-sharp, reading the temperature, the humidity, the shifting gusts of wind like a language only she could understand. And the old instructor, leaning under the observation tower, recognized the way she moved and felt his chest tighten, because he remembered the last time he saw her on a field. Much harsher than this one, where decisions were measured in lives, not trophies, and the moment he saw her shoulders settle, he knew something powerful was waking inside her, even if no one else could see it yet, and the air around her seemed to thicken, with anticipation as if the world itself knew she was standing on the edge of awakening something dangerous, something unstoppable, something she could no longer hide. Her heart was calm, like still water, while memories flickered behind her eyes of nights spent in hostile territory listening to distant thumps of artillery and feeling the silent pulse of danger pushing against every breath. Yet those memories did not weaken her. They sharpened her, and as she assembled the rifle, she felt that familiar alignment between her body and the weapon, the precise harmony that once made her shots whisper through the air with impossible accuracy, striking targets others deemed unreachable, and though she had sworn never to let that side of her resurface, she knew deep inside that destiny does not sleep. It only waits patiently until the right moment arrives. And now that moment was standing in front of her, wearing the shape of a challenge, disguised as a casual exhibition match just for fun. But she could already sense the eyes turning toward her, the air going quiet as curious competitors paused mid-sentence, not understanding why a strange unease crawled through them like cold water running down their spine, making them feel as though they were standing near a sleeping predator that was about to open its eyes. With the rifle fully assembled, she rose slower than the rest, but with a grace that made time seem to hesitate around her. And when she stepped onto the firing platform, the wooden boards beneath her boots creaked softly as though acknowledging the weight of the history she carried, and the spotters nearby glanced at her setup, confused by the simplicity of her gear compared to the expensive equipment the others used. But what they could not see was that her advantage was not measured in technology. It was carved into her instincts, into the rhythm of her breathing, and the unmoving calm that wrapped around her soul like armor forged in war. And the spectators, leaning against the fence, pushed closer, sensing that something was different about her, something dangerous and unpredictable, and the announcer reading off names paused when hers came up, because even he felt the shift in the atmosphere, as if the Range itself was no longer an ordinary field, but a battlefield where legends could rise and fall. And in that moment, with the wind picking up and conversations fading into silence, everyone waited to see whether she would simply take a shot like the rest or shatter every expectation with a single pull of the trigger. She lay behind the rifle, her cheek pressing gently against the stock, her eye settling behind the scope, with a familiarity that sank into her bones like coming home after years of wandering, and the long stretch of landscape sprawled before her like a test written by fate itself, with each rise and dip in the terrain reflecting the obstacles she had conquered in life. And her finger hovered near the trigger, not touching it, yet letting herself feel the weight of the moment, the endless potential swirling in that narrow space between stillness and fire. And in the distance, a steel target shimmered under the sun at a range considered outrageous by most shooters, the kind of distance that mocked ordinary skill and demanded perfection. And for the first time in years, she felt the pulse of pure focus ignite within her bloodstream, a fire that burned quietly but intensely, promising that once released, it would scorch everything in its path. And as the wind shifted again, brushing across the range like a whispered warning, a chilling realization sank into the crowd that they were not watching a casual shooter playing with a borrowed rifle they were witnessing the return of something far more formidable, and none of them were prepared for what would happen when she finally decided to take the shot that could change everything. The wind curled across the range like a living thing twisting through the air in unpredictable spirals, while she kept her breathing steady and her eyes locked through the scope, reading every subtle movement in the mirage, as though the earth itself was whispering secrets only she could understand. And while the shooters beside her fumbled with expensive wine meters and software, she relied on instinct sharpened by nights in hostile valleys where wind was not a number on a screen, but the difference between survival and death, and that instinct told her the window to shoot was approaching, not yet, but soon, and the stillness in her body felt like a bow, drawn tight, ready to release, as the crowd pressed closer, trying to see what she was doing, but unable to comprehend the depth of control coiled inside her, like a hidden storm that was waiting for one undeniable moment to unleash itself upon the world in a way no one would forget. She adjusted the elevation turret with slow precision, each click echoing in her mind like a heartbeat, while the spotter nearby tried to predict her intention, whispering numbers under his breath, but he could not keep up with the speed of her calculations, because she was not reacting to the environment, she was predicting it. And when the mirage bent slightly left, she saw the future trajectory of the bullet, stretching across the impossible distance to the target, balanced on the edge of a rocky ridge. And though most shooters feared such long-range shots because of the endless variables, she felt only clarity and control, as if the wind, the temperature, the earth, and the rifle were all part of a single rhythm only she could hear, and the people watching from behind the barricades could sense that she was about to attempt something unreal. Yet they held, their breath not daring to speak, because the atmosphere around her felt too sacred, too dangerous to interrupt. Memories flickered behind her eyes of the last mission she ever took, where she lay in the dirt for hours, unseen, unheard, invisible, while chaos erupted in the valley below. And when the call came through her radio, she made the impossible shot that saved her unit, but also cost a part of her soul, leaving her with silence instead of celebration. And when she returned home, she swore never to pick up a rifle again, because every bullet carried weight, every target carried consequence, and she did not trust the world to understand that. So when she walked away from that life, she buried her skill beneath ordinary routines and quiet, days ignoring the part of her that still craved the precision of long-range mastery. But destiny has a way of dragging buried things back into the open, and now, with the sun overhead and dozens of eyes watching, she felt that old version of herself, stirring awake like a giant rising from deep within. And though the memory of that final shot haunted her, it also fueled her focus, reminding her that she was not just good, she was extraordinary, and excellence never truly fades. It only waits for the moment it is needed again. The announcer called out her name over the loudspeaker, and the crowd erupted in whispers, wondering if she would even attempt the extreme distance challenge that had humbled every competitor before her, and some laughed, quietly saying she was only given the sniper for fun. Just a novelty, just a distraction. Nothing serious, but those words barely reached her, because her mind was already locked on the target, and her body aligned perfectly behind the rifle like a predator settling into the shadows before the strike, and the instructor watching from the tower felt a deep tension coil in his chest because he had seen this exact posture before, not in competitions, but in war zones where she became something beyond human, something relentless and unshakable. And as the range fell silent, so silent that even the wind seemed to pause, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation as though the world was holding its breath. Right along with her waiting to see the outcome of a single bullet that had not yet been fired but already felt destined to carve itself into history. She inhaled slowly, letting the air fill her lungs, and then released it in a long, controlled exhale, allowing the noise of the world to fade until all that remained was the target, the trigger, and the steady thump of her heartbeat guiding her timing with surgical precision. And in that moment, she did not feel pressure or doubt. She felt purpose pure and undeniable, as if every moment of her life had been leading her to this exact second, and when the mirage flattened just enough and the wind settled into perfect alignment, she knew she had found the window she had been waiting for. And her finger brushed the trigger with a feather-light touch, holding the final ounce of pressure in perfect balance, ready to break the silence with one motion. And as the entire crowd leaned forward, eyes wide, breaths held, hearts pounding, the air trembled on the edge of transformation because they all sensed that the shot she was about to take would not just test her skill, it would redefine what was possible, and nothing would ever be the same again once the trigger finally broke. The moment the trigger broke. The sound cracked through the range like lightning, splitting the sky as the rifle bucked softly against her shoulder, with the smooth recoil of a perfectly controlled shot, and the bullet tore through the air, disappearing from sight almost instantly, while time itself seemed to slow for everyone watching, because they knew this was not an ordinary attempt. This was a shot aimed at the edge of human capability, and the silence that followed was thick and heavy as dozens of heads turned toward the distant ridge, where the steel target waited in stillness, but no one could see the impact yet, and the uncertainty pressed into their chests like a physical weight, making their hearts pound harder with every passing second, as if the world itself hesitated to reveal whether she had done the impossible or reached too far beyond mortal limits. And in that infinite pause, the range was no longer just a competition ground. It felt like an arena where legends were born or broken, and every eye remained locked on the horizon, while the echo of the shot continued to fade like the last note of a haunting song. Inside her mind, everything was quiet, a deeper quiet than the crowd could ever understand, because she had entered that rare state of absolute focus where instinct merged with calculation and time lost meaning. And she could feel the bullet's flight as if it were still part of her racing across the vast stretch of terrain, slipping through shifting winds, diving and climbing with precision as gravity tugged at it relentlessly. But she trusted her adjustments, trusted her instincts, trusted the years of experience carved into her soul like scripture. And even as the world around her held its breath, she remained calm, her cheek still resting on the stock, her finger gently resting against the trigger guard as though ready to fire again without hesitation, because whether the shot hit or missed, she was not afraid. She was awake, and she remembered who she truly was, and that was more dangerous, more powerful than anything she had felt in years. And though the crowd could not see it, there was a storm rising behind her eyes, a storm that said she was just getting started. Then the Moment came like a thunderclap without sound as a faint metallic ping echoed across the range, carried by the wind, like a ghostly bell ringing in the distance, and at first no one reacted because the sound was so soft, so surreal that their minds refused to believe it. But when the spotter on the far ridge raised his hand and shouted confirmation, the silence shattered into chaos as the crowd erupted in disbelief and shock and awe, pouring through the field like a tidal wave of roaring voices and stunned faces and wide eyes, struggling to comprehend what had just happened, because she had not merely hit the target, she had struck it dead center at a range that most considered unreachable, a range beyond logic, beyond common sense, beyond anything they had seen in their entire lives, and the announcer fumbled for words, his voice cracking as he tried to speak while competitors dropped their rifles in astonishment, some laughing in disbelief, others shaking their heads as if trying to wake from a dream, and the noise swelled into a storm of cheers and shouts. But even then, some could only stare silently, unable to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Yet while the world exploded around her, she rose slowly from the ground with the same calm she had before the shot, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she had simply done what needed to be done, and her expression remained unreadable, except for the quiet fire glowing in her eyes, a fire that said, this was not luck. It was skill and control and mastery, born from years of sacrifice and pain, and the instructor watching from the tower felt a shiver run down his spine because he remembered that look he had seen it once before, in a different place under a blood-red sky when she brought her entire unit home with a shot that should have been impossible, and as she slung the rifle over her shoulder and stepped down from the platform, the crowd parted instinctively before her like a tide, retreating from the shore not out of fear, but out of reverence, sensing that they were in the presence of something powerful, something rare, something unstoppable. And the whispers followed her like shadows, painting her name into the air as people tried to understand how someone so quiet, so unassuming, had just rewritten the meaning of precision with a single bullet. But the shot was only the beginning, because with great power comes great disruption, and while many cheered, there were a few whose pride had been shattered by what they had witnessed, and jealousy began to swirl in dark corners like smoke from a dying fire, as some competitors muttered excuses about luck, about wind, about unfair advantages, refusing to accept that she was simply better than them, and deeper still within the event staff. There were those who felt threatened by the attention she had drawn, knowing that her presence alone could shift the hierarchy of their world and change everything they stood on. And among the crowd, a reporter pushed through, frantically dialing his editor, while planning to blast her story across every media outlet in the country. But he was not the only one watching her with intent, because farther back near the edge of the range, a man in a dark jacket observed in silence, his eyes sharp and calculating, recognizing her beyond the title of competitor because he knew where she came from. He knew her past, and he knew that a shot like that one could only be made by someone trained in places the public would never hear about. And as she walked off the firing line with quiet steps and a heart beating steady, the world around her erupted with noise and chaos and celebration. But deep in the shadows, something else began to move silently, preparing to drag her back into a life she thought she had escaped. And the question that now hovered in the air, thicker than smoke, was not how she made the shot, but what would happen next, now that she had awakened. The ghosts of the past, with one impossible pull of the trigger. She could feel the shift around her, as officials rushed forward with forced smiles and eager words, while hidden tension coiled beneath their voices like snakes in tall grass. And though they praised her accomplishment, their eyes held calculation, as if measuring how dangerous her presence could become if the truth of her skill reached too far beyond this range, and the cheering crowd unknowingly fueled the pressure as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions desperate to claim a piece of her story. Yet even louder than the chaos outside was the quiet warning inside her mind, telling her that this was no longer about competition. This was about exposure and exposure was the one thing she had spent years avoiding. So she stepped back, refusing interviews and ignoring applause, but the man in the dark jacket kept watching her with cold familiarity, as if he was not surprised by anything she had done. And when their eyes briefly met, she felt the chill of recognition, even though she could not place his face, and in that instant she knew her past was reaching for her again. And whatever waited beyond this moment was far more dangerous than any bullet she had ever fired, and the real battle was only just beginning. She stared at him in the dim light, her heartbeat steady even as the past clawed its way back to the surface, and she realized this was not a request. It was a summons shaped by necessity and danger. And though every part of her longed to remain hidden, the world beyond this quiet range was already shifting in ways she could feel like tremors before an earthquake, and he spoke of targets beyond borders, threats that required a mind like hers, a precision like hers, a calm that only she possessed. And deep inside, she understood that fate was circling her again, pulling her toward a path she thought she had escaped. And as the wind whispered across the empty night, she felt the weight of the rifle case in her hand like destiny tapping her shoulder, reminding her that legends are not born from comfort, but from challenge, and the choice before her would change everything.